Hey everyone, today we have a very special guest. We're joined by Preston Rutherford. He's one of the co-founders of Chubbies, and he's got a new startup, Marathon. And he's gonna come in and dissect your entire marketing strategy when you're trying to grow your business. He's gonna give us the lessons learned, the biggest mistakes he made. He's gonna give you some cheat sheets, and he's got some very controversial takes on some things you should for sure not do in your marketing. Let's get to today's episode. You started Chubbies. You were in that kind of direct consumer e-commerce, and then obviously Chubbies expanded and did full distribution and everything. And for folks who are unfamiliar with the brand, it's kind of a lifestyle clothing brand. And you and I met because you're writing a bunch of awesome stuff in what I would call the very unique screenplay format, where it's like CMO character, CEO character, CFO character, and they're all talking back and forth to each other about kind of common problems and how you solve them. And I'd say one of like the core themes, like if somebody's just tuning in for a couple minutes of the show today, one of the themes of your work is like, wow, marketers are way too short-term focused, and they're way too focused on believing that the data they're looking at is like 100% accurate and absolute when it's not. And is that the right read? And kind of like, tell us the background story of like building Chubbies and like how you came to those assumptions, if my takeaways from your writings are right.
Yeah, totally. So from the perspective of answering the first part of the question, is that the correct read? Yeah, I'd say that's spot on, but maybe that's more of like, I don't want to have an antagonistic tone of like, you all are so short-term focused, you're a bunch of idiots. And I know you're not saying that.
So you can blame it on me, it's fine.
Yeah, no, I know. But like just addressing the tension of like, I know I need to build a brand and I know I need to invest against it, but it's hard because it's harder to measure. And we've been trained on this short-term feedback loop that is really, really effective and in all ways, or in a lot of ways, worked extremely well for many years for folks. And so anyways, yes, you're spot on. Just this notion of like brand building for modern brands and how to do it and how to implement it, because I think a lot of the information that I had while I was quote unquote growing up was like research and big company stuff and stuff that to me just didn't feel applicable at all. It was like, oh yeah, well, they've been around for 100 years, or oh yeah, they've got like a $50 million marketing budget, or whatever it might be. So it's, yeah, the intention is like, try to make it real for folks like us who are just going out there trying to build brands. And then the format, to your point, I tried a bunch of stuff, like threw a bunch of stuff at the wall as I was trying to just convey these ideas in ways that were kind of like fun, I think, for people to read, fun for me to write, and allowed me to get to a level of like, maybe like nuance and resonance without being like, I'm telling you from some high horse of like what to do, but more just like, no, man, I have had every one of those one-on-ones or meetings myself. Like I've been the person who doesn't get it. I've banged my hand on the table being like, we have to do this brand thing. And then getting a response being like, but what are we going to get for it? How much money are we going to make? And me just being like, I don't know, but we got to do it. So now that I've been out of the business for a bit and done some reflecting on like all of the mistakes that I've made, it's been somewhat helpful to be able to process. And then just the notion of like feeling like you're in the room with people, I think, at least to me, allows me to sort of like humanize it a little bit, make it a little bit more engaging. And that's the way that all of this stuff manifested for me, was like in the conference room or over Zoom on a one-on-one or in these exec meetings or whatever you want to call it. And it seems like we've all had it too. And, we scan Twitter and LinkedIn and these people are just like, I'm making $1 million a month on my Facebook ads, or I just got purchased for $1 billion, or like, here are the 10 pieces of creative you need to run, or the 10 ad formats that are going viral right now, or whatever it is. And I just kind of felt like, because I was this person, like I was reading this stuff and I was like, we got to do this. Let's do this. So let's drop everything and do this. And it felt like no one was like, kind of, I don't know, like speaking to me at my stage, trying to just be like, I'm an idiot, just like you're an idiot. And we're just trying to figure this stuff out. Like, I'm not trying to be the person who knows it all sort of thing. But like, if I can speak from some sort of like I didn't know, and here's me just trying to wade through it and figure out in some form of a format that can potentially be engaging, well, shoot, let's try it.
I think a lot of people who watch this show are in a seat that you were in a few years ago, right? They've got a small budget, they've got a brand that's growing, and they're just trying to figure out what to do. They're trying to like look at the hacks, look at the examples, do all of those things. And like, can you give them a little bit of a treasure map of like some mistakes that you made that they could not make, so that maybe they could have a, if not easier, at least maybe quicker journey to success?
Yeah, fewer gray hairs and sleepless nights would be awesome to bestow upon humanity. First point I would make is just the classic, like, as it relates to Chubbies, I was one of 4 founders. They were 10,000 times smarter than I. And then I was the one making all the mistakes, so I can speak to the mistakes, being hyperbolic. But then all about the team, right? All the credit to the team, any success that Chubbies had, to the team, just a tiny itty bitty bit. I guess maybe the credit I would take is like, I was the one making all the mistakes that were just so obviously bad that then it became obvious that this isn't the way to do it. So then they fixed everything. But so making sure I put that out there, but like some mistakes to try to avoid. I've been thinking a lot about this, obviously. So like 3 things, and some are more marketing centric, some are less. But one is just like how I would be so, and this is like more general, I would be so slow to take on additional fixed costs early. Like we want to hire, we want to get help, we want to get the best people. But that is one of the things that is sort of like the main problem that then causes us to be so short-termist in the first place, because we need this crazy fast cash turn. Because if we don't get the fast cash turn, because we have no buffer in our P&L, because we've hired all these people, we've gotten a nice office space, we did all these things that you don't necessarily have to do early on. If we don't drive that fast revenue, like we put because we already got cash out buying inventory, you know what I mean? So if we're, or building the product or whatever it is. So then if we're also allocating working capital to then drive revenue, to then turn that stuff that we're doing into cash, if it's not paying out right away, like we just go out of business. So that's one of the main things that is totally unsexy. Like, and I'm not saying fire everybody, but I'm just saying that's a big deal. And it doesn't feel like marketing, but it is marketing, because if you have more cash, you can spend more. And if you have more cash, if you have more buffer, you don't need the cash to come back right away. And it's needing the cash to come back right away that causes us to just maybe make the mistake that it leads to, which is just like chasing ROAS, particularly short-term revenue-based ROAS, where it works everything works at the beginning, right? I mean, I think that's the thing that everyone learns, because when you start a business, to the extent you can rise above some level of noise, there's latent demand that hasn't been tapped into. Like that's fundamentally why you started the business in the first place. So every dollar you spend is both high ROAS and highly incremental. Because if you didn't spend it, they wouldn't know about you in the first place, right? So like you're generating the awareness. And so you're doing the brand marketing, you're filling the funnel, and you're emptying the funnel kind of like all at the same time. But those are like the highest intent folks, right? Like you started the business because you got some signal from the world that there was this untapped need that was just sort of like, people's hair's on fire because they need this thing. At least that's the hope when you start a business. So the second mistake that I would sort of like say, try to avoid is just like, listen to your gut as it relates to like, if I'm feeling increased friction, the solve isn't friction, meaning like customer acquisition costs going up, or it's harder to do XYZ, like just the performance of my paid or my DR or whatever you want to call it, marketing in general, is I'm feeling headwinds. I would suggest that the way that you audit it is not to necessarily jump to the solution being make my DR more effective, make my website convert better. Yes, those are important. Those are probably problematic. But one of the things that I learned is like, at least from like a perspective, and I'm speaking very like e-com centric sort of thing, but maybe it's applicable more broadly, but like step back and just be like, what truly is the total addressable market of my Shopify store for my particular category, given the awareness that I've achieved, right? What was just so stunning to me was, like, at the end of the day, the amount of shopping, just overall, like consumer spending that I'm accessing with my Shopify store is like 6% of total retail sales, if that makes sense. So like 85% of retail sales is brick and mortar. 60-70% of that is owned by Amazon, Macy's, Walmart.com, Etsy, eBay, et cetera, et cetera. So if I'm not in any of those places, like I'm spending 100% of my marketing dollars on 6% of purchase opportunities, and purchase behaviors are extremely sticky. So they're just people I'm never going to touch. And everyone's like Shopify TAM is different, right? But one of the things that mistake that I made was just like, no, it's about my ads. I need to double my variance. I need to do a complete audit, complete CRO overhaul on my website. I need to test new channels. I need to do whatever, like all hands on deck. And I think one of my lessons was spend some time on it, but like the opportunity cost of the time spent really diminishes on trying to fix that. And what the solution broadly might be is just you're not reaching enough people with content that gets them to feel and remember you. And your product isn't available broadly enough. And that to me wasn't a realization that I had. So that was a big mistake that I made. And then the third mistake that I would call out, and then I'll just shut up because there are infinity more that mistakes that I could make, is just this general idea of questioning our assumptions, particularly as it relates to what brand marketing means. So what do I mean by that? I think I can put myself in my shoes. When I think brand marketing, I think John Hamm, Mad Men, sitting on a couch, 3 martini lunches, not knowing how much money you drove from the ads you did, like backroom deals, good old boys club, whatever you want to call it, but just like the opposite of accountable marketing that I can measure, that I know drives my business, that is available to folks, to your point, who don't have endless money. And so that was an aversion that I just had. I felt that it was visceral. So anytime you said brand marketing, I said, get out of my face. Or I said, if it doesn't show up in platform reporting tools like in Facebook Ads Manager or whatever, it doesn't exist. So I think just the realization that one of the like sub mistakes was just this general idea of like, I think everyone knows about my brand, but no one knows about my brand. So there's no way I can have a big business if no one knows about my brand. Like if my awareness is sub 1% or whatever, but that feels amorphous and not actionable. Like how do I get awareness? Yeah, you can measure and stuff like that. But just the general, like, first principles, like I need to have a set of people who know me and feel something about me. Like if I look at my own purchase behaviors, I am not making objective purchase decisions. Like just look at my credit card statement. It is completely emotionally driven. I mean, I'm looking right here in my office and there's a bunch of stuff that I just got in the mail. I'm like, why did I buy this? And it's because I felt something, about this brand, and it took over. And yes, there was some rationality associated with it, but I'm looking over here. I'm like, it wasn't their DR that got me. Maybe ultimately, but there was a bunch of stuff that they were doing beforehand that got me to go. And whether it be existing for a long period of time or doing just amazing, funny or interesting content, but they were doing a lot of stuff that wasn't driving short-term measurable revenue as part of their strategy. And I think that's the problem. It's just this notion of, another mistake, lack of balance, right? So like, we spent 100% of our marketing dollars and it was all evaluated by how it drove short-term revenue. And like, that just felt like the right way to do it. I remember we were written up in a Wall Street Journal article for being so data-driven. And so it was like, we would take pride in this stuff. And it ended up being completely wrong not to measure, not to be data-driven, but to not be thoughtful enough about, are we measuring the right things? Not stepping back, like just using like this easy, oh, well, the data's right there. I mean, like this drives everything. This drives all capital allocation decision. So anyways, variety of mistakes that I've made. We can dig into any, or I'd be happy to go into more, but those are some mistakes where what I would do is just find balance, know that you need to reach way more people than you're reaching right now. And you need to do it with content that gets people to remember and feel. And it's probably not the creative that you're running now. If you've been around for a bit and you've been chasing ROAS and you've found that like you look at your ads and it kind of feels like you're one of those wacky wavy inflatable tube men at a used car dealership, right? Trying to convert people with a big CTA and a lot of urgency. Maybe it was effective at the beginning when you were like, brand is all that matters. But we all go through this stage of like, oh God, look at the creative that I'm running right now. Is this truly everything that I'm putting out into the world? So that's probably the big thing, but you got to measure it. And so you got to find ways to measure it, but it is all measurable. And it's wasting more money if you're just doing short term only, because it by definition gets more and more expensive over time. I mean, Meta just reported earnings and average cost per ad is up 11%. So it's just like, do you want to have average costs increasing 11% every year if you're not going to just like do anything that helps to fight that? And the only way to fight that is by getting customers that don't have to click your ads and they still buy, right? It's like, what are you doing to drive that kind of purchase behavior? Most folks aren't doing nearly enough.
There's so much hype around AI right now. We talk about it on the show all the time. And so many people are going to use AI in the wrong ways. The smart people and the smart marketers are going to use it in the best ways. Like at HubSpot, AI is transforming so much of our marketing. It's helping us clean up our data, transcribe our videos and content from one language to multilingual, boosting our conversion rates with personalized emails and landing page. And that is just the tip of what we are doing. And if you're a smart marketer and you want to transform your work with AI, we have just published an amazing 12-page AI prompt guide that goes through some of the best AI prompts for marketers right now. So if you're maybe uncertain of use cases or how to get started with a prompt, this is the perfect guide for you. We have linked it in the description below. So go and click that link, check that guide out. Now back to today's show.
What did you all do so like I can imagine if you're, going to start a clothing company and decide to start to sell shorts and there's a ton of optionality for people, like, how do you ever break through the noise? And so was it just that you kind of figured out how to use Facebook much better than any of the competitors, and Facebook was getting much more popular back then, so you could get leverage in that way? Like, why did you manage to break through the noise and become such a successful company in that space?
I think that the first thing that we did was we had I'm going to talk brand and I'll talk product, and then we'll go to the obvious things. So like, so what? So like, how did you rise above? We felt there was a brand gap, right? I mean, and there was some recent news, don't want to talk about it, but like 13, 14 years ago, Abercrombie and Fitch was like what cool was in like men's apparel, right? And it was this just such a thing that was like, I viscerally hated it, as did the three other co-founders. And it was like, it was very easy then to just be like, let's be the opposite of that. Let's be fun. Let's not take ourselves seriously. Let's call ourselves Chubbies rather than some like highfalutin name. Let's just be welcoming. Let's like embrace someone not having a six pack and standing in jeans, spraying you with cologne and listening to crappy house music. Like, listen to whatever you want, have a beer belly, you don't have to look a certain way, just be yourself. And so there was a very easy like brand foil that we could build off of that really helped solidify a story. The other piece was just like, we all graduated college in 2008 when it was just like so hard to get a job. There's all this stress around like my identity and hard to get jobs, hard to make money, and the stress, this weight. So that was the other piece of the brand, which kind of like helped us orient around this notion of like bringing levity to the work environment, and sort of like having work and the stressors of work and the stressors of how much my boss sucks and all that kind of stuff be another foil. So we had these really interesting, I wouldn't say enemies, but enemies that then allowed us to have like this story that seemingly wasn't being hit by any other brands. Then from a product perspective, and it makes sense potentially because not that many people at the time were buying tiny shorts. So like TAM was potentially in question, less so now, but no one was making shorter shorts at all. So like there was a definite product gap there. Like the way we played rugby, soccer, and we're from the South. All of those things is where shorter shorts, if anywhere, were a little bit more popular. So, but that was clearly not the trend. Like just remember 2011, it was like Jersey Shore, like cargo shorts down to your ankles and those tight Ed Hardy shirts or whatever. Like it was totally not this notion of like retro, fun, Hawaiian shirts, shorter shorts, flip flops. So those gaps existed. But then I think it was using organic social media in a way that worked. So we didn't do paid for a long time, and we were able to rise above the noise a little bit doing that. And I don't know what you call it now, influencer, creator, whatever, but like UGC was like not super obvious back then. And so like it was somewhat blasphemous to just like take pictures from your crappy iPhone camera at the time of your friends and use that as sort of like a photo shoot, versus classic, black and white, perfect model, chiseled, that being what modeling and what advertising looks like. So being different, like in another form. Like our marketing for the first year was effectively Tom and I taking pictures of each other and going places and doing fun things. And so people, I don't know, people felt like they knew us, and then we added our friends and did all that sort of thing. So it really just felt like a community, but it was like forced. It wasn't like a shoehorn. It was just, we had no money. But then we started to get some money, and that's where like the problem began, if you will, because then we could spend and we could try running some Facebook ads, and we just saw, oh my gosh, can you see these numbers? And it was like $1 in, 10 out, 15 minutes later kind of thing. And yeah, we were good, Kieran. I mean, to your point, I feel like we were good. I mean, we just spent so much time once we saw what was happening, because then it was just like, let's scale this thing, you know? And this notion of scaling, I mean, we thought we were a Silicon Valley software business, right? We raised money from Silicon Valley VCs. We were in San Francisco. We were surrounded, like our friends started Instagram. Our other friends started Snapchat. All of our other friends were early at Facebook. It was like, this is what business is, you know? It's like 0 to $1 billion in 3 months. And we were like, yeah, we're going to get acquired on a 20x revenue multiple in 3 years. None of that obviously happened, but that was the sort of like the thinking. And so anyways, it was like, let's scale, let's take this thing to the moon. And it worked at the beginning because we were continuing to just like work through the latent demand that we hadn't yet reached with our organic efforts. So like in terms of what worked, and we just tried to make great content. I mean, I think that was the thing. Like we had the commodity of commodities, like a men's cotton short. You know, I mean, there are clearly other commodities that are more of a commodity, but like you think of it as like, that's the thing that you would like spend $9 on Amazon or Walmart or whatever. Generally, it was just an afterthought. So trying to turn it into something that you're charging $50, $60, $70 for, absurd, right? So then we kind of acknowledged that, and we just kind of knew, well, let's just create content that feels like it's just as good or fun or funny as the stuff that is like on your text thread with your friends, where you're all kind of like sharing memes or sharing funny videos or talking shit to each other or whatever it might be, like that feeling. Or let's just try to be the best content that they see all day on social, whether or not it's an ad. That's kind of like where it started. And I think that worked pretty well. Of just sort of like, we are trying so hard to make you laugh and to make great content. We are not trying to sell. This was at the beginning. And I think people liked that. Like when you get the text from your friends being like, that ad was hilarious, or that email was hilarious. We just spent so much time on it. And I think that worked. Like, I think people felt like, okay, I kind of know them. They're working really hard. They're trying to make me laugh, and they are making me laugh, and they're having fun, and they're kind of living the dream that I want to live, which is start a business, but I can't because I'm stuck in this cubicle. It was hitting, I think, on all of those sorts of themes. So I think that was part of it. And I do think tactically, like, we were good. We were always looking for that little arbitrage, right? If I just run this placement, but with this objective, and this creative, like that's not how it was originally intended to be built. So I can drive this result that is just like where I'm getting 10x the returns than other people. Like, but that obviously that's not sustainable. It works for a week and then it's on to the next thing. But I think we were kind of good at that, like adapting to what the platforms was giving us, trying all the betas, figuring out how to use the thing in a way that wasn't intentionally, for which it wasn't intentionally built, but where we could sort of like make use of it. So it was probably a little bit of both at the beginning.
I guess my follow-up there is like part of that too. Like when you guys were good and building this business, it was also kind of the golden age of the Facebook and Meta advertising product. You had all the detail, all the data. It was pre-Cambridge Analytica. It was the golden age of digital marketing. And there are a lot of people who are starting companies right now who missed that era, and we're in this new era. And if you were talking, which I imagine you do very regularly, to somebody who's a year or two into their business right now, in this era that we're living in now, what would you tell them to do differently? You know, like, where do you think the arbitrage lies today? And for everybody watching, like, arbitrage is just, you know, it's buying low, selling high, and it's a much more competitive internet today. It's harder to find those buy low, sell high opportunities. So like, where do you think they are, and where would you kind of point people in the direction of?
I think the place where I would start is like from a mindset perspective in terms of like how long this stuff is going to take. I think that's maybe the first thing I would start with, like, because I think we get into problems when we think this is going to happen overnight. So from that perspective, like if we know this is a 5, 10, 15-year slog, if you're going to be starting something, we'll behave differently. Tactically, though, I hate saying content is king because it's like such a stupid thing to say, but being able to create content, build a community, build an audience who listens to you.
So where would you do that? Where would you do that today?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on my business, but I mean, I still think there's a lot of gold on Instagram. There's a lot of gold on LinkedIn. If you're trying to build a business where you're trying to sell to retailers or buyers, or if you're trying to build a consulting business, I mean, LinkedIn, can I say shit? LinkedIn, the heck out of it.
You can say whatever you want.
Okay. LinkedIn, the shit out of it. I'm seeing Twitter. You can get some broad distribution and engagement. I would absolutely do what you're doing with long form content, right? I mean, this notion of minutes of focused attention I think a lot of people know it and it's obvious, but it's probably the most underrated metric that you can think about having. So figuring out long form, knowing, like, I'd be curious to hear you guys' thoughts in terms of like listenership from when you started, how long you've been doing it, how long it takes to grow, particularly organically. Maybe a hot take. I would not use agencies for anything. I would find people who can create content internally.
I love this take.
I would have as many people making content as making product. I would focus like 50% of I'm being hyperbolic, but like of my salary toward content creation. I do think there's a world of just like getting someone who already has massive organic reach who's a fit for your brand and having them be a co-founder, giving them a bunch of equity, and just, you know, like you got to self-select and it's got to be the right fit. But like that just helps you jump years ahead, right? And figuring out how to make that work. But organic reach is tough, as we all know, right? So just like figure out how to be exceptional at creating content, because exceptional content works. Shitty content does not. And that's why we just need a lot of reps too. So like what might be the hottest of hot takes? Don't use agencies. Have a creative content machine in-house where you're creating at least like, 2 videos a week, huge, bigger, like tentpole content pieces that just really do the thing that you're trying to do. For us, it's humor, that are just amazing advertisements, great advertisements. Doesn't have to go viral. Virality is a farce. It's a vanity metric that you should ignore, is the other thing that's maybe hottish, steamy. I don't know. But the other is cheap. Like another reason why not to use agencies is because they're just going to charge you out the butt. And we need to be cheap so we can be high velocity and high learning. So like to the extent you're using external parties, so much context is lost. I would not have separate creative and media teams. Like I would not do briefs and then hand them over to the creative team and then have them create content and then send it back over to the media team to have them run the media. So much lost context, right? People, it's just, I think it's also a farce that those should be separate siloed teams, because that just doesn't work as well. Even though that's like the best practice. Couple of takes, but all around this notion of content, build an audience, create stuff that just rises above the noise, gets people to feel, and like say what you will about a brand like Liquid Death, if you will, but like before they even sold a product, they validated that they could create content that would resonate around this brand, before anything. Like that would totally be my recommendation if you're not going to like have Selena Gomez and you know what I mean. So some thoughts.
Hey everybody, before we continue with the show today, I'm really asking for your help. We want to know what is keeping you away from your goals. As we continue to make shows for marketers like you, we want to make sure that we're hitting the mark. We're putting together our next round of episodes, and we want to make sure that we're addressing all the challenges that you're facing. So we've put together a quick survey to understand your biggest challenges, and we'd love to hear from you. Kind of going back to this notion of like, what the heck you do when you're getting started. I think you gave people some really good advice around like, oh, you got to be cheap in the early days. And I think one of the things I've learned, and I wonder if you learned, is that like the constraints of small are really awesome. When it turns out, like when you have a lot of money and you can do a lot of things, you are more likely to mess up. And like, I think like most people in the like, hey, I don't have much money situation are like, oh, this stinks. I can't wait till I have money. And I think I'd just be like, really appreciate that you don't have money. I can't tell you how awesome it is that you don't have money, because it forces you to be so focused and so thoughtful about the work you're doing. Like, I even think back to the story you were telling about like, yeah, we were just like posting content that was like us texting back and forth or taking pictures on our trip. It's like, you wouldn't have done, if you didn't have the constraints, you would have done some fancy photo shoot and it wouldn't have been half as good.
So right? Well said. Yeah, you nailed it. Got me so excited. So,
it's so frustrating.
It is. It totally is. And I felt all of the things that you were just saying myself. God, if we just had some money, we got to go out and raise money. And then what we learned is exactly what you said. We get sloppy. Humans, when you got a lot of money, when you've got too many resources, you get sloppy. You start doing dumb stuff. A lot of dumb stuff. One of them is, to your point, like, maybe you'll hire some really expensive people, some really expensive talent, some really expensive blah, blah, blah. And it just won't work. For us, we found that the more we spent on a piece of content, the worse it did. That was just our experience.
Yeah.
But
it's a lot of people's experience.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's so funny. The other thing, like, is when let's talk like hiring or people or just doing more things, testing more channels. There's so much admin associated with that, where it's pulling you away from doing the work that actually builds the brand, like creating content or creating products. So like, many of us are just bad managers, So we'll spend a lot of time where maybe like we won't be doubling impact. We'll be like increasing it by like 10% because we're such bad managers and we don't know how to train people and they don't have the context that we have as founders. And we would have been so much better off just waiting 2 years before we hired this role, sort of thing. Or we are unable to make a new channel work, even though we kind of think, well, we should be doing more. We got to be doing more. We got to experiment, right? It's such a blessing to be able to not have money for a variety of reasons. Like, the other is it forces, like you were saying, it forces you to be like, think differently and be focused. It also forces you to be more creative. Like, when you're in this machine of, all right, so I put money here, generally 4 comes out or 5 comes out, this kind of creative seems to do the thing. What I would suggest and what I wish I did for a longer time is just imagine like ads don't, like paid, imagine doesn't exist for much longer. You know what I mean? Imagine there's no word for ROAS. Imagine there's no, right? Because that's how we did things at the beginning. It was just more notable things, more different. Like, we weren't thinking like everything has to go into a Facebook ad. Like, because marketing can take the form, marketing against the grain can take the form of infinite different things, right? Totally. I mean, it can be one of my favorite stories is like someone created a job spec for a really funny job and they put it out. And I think maybe they hit up some local news station and that just took off. Like, it created so much, I don't know, billion earned impression, whatever it might be, but it's just really interesting. And if you were just thinking through the lens of like, I got to run my Facebook and TikTok and I got to get my influencers, or I've got to get my affiliates and I need my cost per lead to come down or my MQLs to go from here to here, it just limits, and so like just the freedom of having zero money is amazing. The other piece is what you can say when you don't have money, when you don't have investors, when you don't have all this stuff, compliance, you can say stuff. You can call out the big guys and gals.
You have nothing to lose.
You have nothing to lose, and it makes them look dumb to come after you, so they're not going to do it. Or if they do, that's then more marketing content that you can use. Like, you have this structural advantage of being able to do and say things that the incumbents cannot. And that is actually, I don't know, maybe the biggest advantage that you have when you like have nothing.
Well, yeah, and I completely agree with that. I think one of the other advantages you have is just like when you have nothing, it's easier to say no. Like, one of the big things I would tell everybody is like, once you get obsessed with like, oh, I need to do more different things, then what happens is you have a spreadsheet of tactics and you get a little bit, like, you're like, oh, I get like 2% of my customers from this thing, 3% of my customers from this thing, 1% of my customers thing. So you're like, oh, I got to keep doing them. That's like 5% of my customers. I can't just stop doing those things. And you're like, well, wait a second. That means you're not spending enough time and money and effort on the thing that's getting you like 50% of your customers. And you're like completely sub-optimizing how you're actually going to grow and make an impact. And this is like what I see over and over again, like talking to startups or looking at like the kind of performance of companies and their P&L is like, oh, you guys have just said no to some, or you said yes to some stuff that like isn't that good. And you just and you can't walk away from doing it once you decided to do it for some reason.
Yes. Oh, I mean, yeah, it's hard to walk back, especially if you've added people or if you've put KPIs in place or if people's bonuses are based on this sort of stuff. You know what I mean? It's like impossible. But yeah, what it also does, there's like opportunity cost to every like focus minute you apply to anything, right? So
yes,
when you start focusing on these little like minute, I'm going to dial the knob 15 basis points, you're completely losing the opportunity to just be like, well, what's the thing that can double my business over the next 5 years sort of thing? Like the big step function things. So just to add to what you were saying, like put your focus on the core, the cash cow and focus on that, but then be open to or force yourself to have space to just think about what are some of these really big tectonic moves that I should be making or could be making? And what do I need to do now to get that ball rolling? Like for us, that was like starting to sell through different retailers or whatever it might be, these things that are like multi-year initiatives that like when we're just dialing these little tiny knobs that are helping on the margin, we pull ourselves away from.
Okay, a couple things. One, I think you made a really good point that may have flown under the radar to people. Like when we started the show, one of the things you talked about is like, oh, keep your costs low and like don't hire people too soon. And what you essentially were talking about, I think, was like optionality. You're like, oh, give yourself some optionality, some choice in how you want to grow and build this company. And what you just brought up was like, oh, once you've hired people, not only have you lost the money optionality, but you've lost like the flexibility optionality because you're now like, now I've got somebody whose job is to do this thing full time. And if I think this thing's not important, now it's like, oh, I have like employment laws and like real things I have to go and do and deal with to stop doing this thing. It just isn't me in a basement or a contractor or something where it's like, I can just decide to no longer do this thing and just give up on it. It's like, no, there's going to be like real ramifications for that. And I think that is a really powerful point that you're making is like optionality turns out to be really, really important.
Right.
Kind of transition from there though. In the building of Chubbies, what I'd love to know is like, you've talked to me about a lot of the mistakes and a lot of the wins. Like, what was like the single biggest win and the single worst mistake? Like give us like the true like fidelity of like, oh man, like that was super awesome and that was super painful in the building of all of this.
The biggest win we made at Chubbies was this transition from 100% focus on DR to this balance of figuring out how to measurably invest in both brand and performance in a way that we could get confidence doing. It took years to transition, but it was like the win that kind of took us from like a relatively fast growing but slower growing, e-com brand, breaking even, losing money every year to re-accelerating growth, like totally fighting the assumption that, maybe this business just has a natural ceiling to it. Oh, okay. It makes sense that they're
that excuse is always just an excuse for bad execution, by the way. There's a ceiling to this business. That's crap.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I remember someone saying that, someone who was kind of like advising it. I was like, first I was depressed and then I was like, no, I got to prove them wrong. You know what I mean? So it was a little bit of that process. It's like the most
passive aggressive way in the world for somebody to tell you you're not good enough.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Like that's what I felt. I was like, I cannot believe you said that. That is, you're right. Perfectly articulated the way you just did. So I think that transition was huge for us. Just kind of like, oh, you're going to do that. You're going to spend your money on that is how I would have thought about it. But then it was like, yeah. And we're able to measure it and it's really working. And it allows us to put more of our creative and ads out into the world that we feel really good about. And so it's like making our intuition concrete. I think the biggest mistake was not making the transition early enough, being like pretty myopic, like we're data driven. If it doesn't drive short term, it doesn't drive anything. What drives short-term revenue is the best indicator of what's going to drive total return for the business. Facebook ads is all that exists. Organic content, let's just rely on the algorithm, maybe try to go viral. But it's really not the focus. We would never pay to put money behind any of this content because it's certainly not going to drive short-term revenue, even if it's like great content that people loved, the ones who saw it, like that transition, I wish that would have happened earlier so that we could have just, like, it took a decade to go from zero to an acquisition. Huge blessing. Could have just as easily not happened in a variety of ways. But that, talking sleepless nights and gray hairs, making that transition, I think, a little bit earlier and up leveling to just like, what is the reality of how people shop and why are they shopping? And are my actions commensurate with the way that I shop, the decisions that I make emotionally, mostly? And just realizing that the answer is no. And like, if we're going to measure things, like make sure we're measuring the right things. Not that driving short-term revenue is bad, but just being out of balance, I think, was bad and probably was our biggest mistake.
Well, and you might just say what you just said for my last question, but my last question is like, there's a bunch of founders, there's a bunch of marketers watching this show today. What do you hope the marketer and CEO/founder conversation would be? Like, what's the one conversation those two people should have about marketing that they're kind of avoiding or maybe not having or don't know to have yet?
Yeah, I'd say it probably just starts with like, let's be real about this current situation right now and like what the trends have been over the last 3-4 years. Like, are we discounting more? Are customer acquisition costs going up? Are we kicking the can down the road? Like, what does this year's Black Friday, Cyber Monday promotion look like versus last year versus 2 years ago versus whatever? Like, are we on discount more days and is the discount bigger? Probably, right? How sustainable is continuing that trend? So like, getting real about the current situation, talk about it, right? Because I think we all feel it, but it needs to be talked about. And then number 2 is just sort of like time horizon. So then the big transition is then like, let's talk time horizon. Like, we're not going to sell the business in 12 months. Everyone thinks they're going to sell the business in 12 months or 18 months or whatever. If you have investors, if you don't, no one's going to sell a business in 18 months. 2 will out of 1,000. And they probably thought they would sell it 18 months ago. So like, just don't orient around that. Orient around a 5-year timeline is what I would just sort of try to say, because that's how brands are built. And then obviously there are outliers, but like, let's be thinking about, okay, this 2025 is a year to get information. It's not a year to get acquired. So it's like a stabilizing year, and it should be a year of moderating your costs, not putting a ton of pressure on growth, moderating your inventory buys, and then just really starting to understand how I can reach more people with higher quality content that I made internally that gets people to engage, that earns engagements, but that also talks about your brand, talks about your company, and makes people feel something. Like, get good at advertising if you're going to do advertising. Like, people are pretty shitty at advertising.
Totally.
And so let's get good at it. And yeah, and so like, why not be exceptional at the thing that is probably one of your 2 moats when you're building a consumer brand? Great product and great marketing. Most of the marketing is sort of like ending up being paid. So just be exceptional at it, be best in the world and own that capability. That would probably be like, after you get real with like current situation, how things aren't trending in the right direction. Let's talk about like timelines and how we're thinking about things and acknowledging that status quo isn't working, and that you have to acknowledge, this is like implied in the whole thing, that what got you here won't get you there. So what does that mean? That means things are going to be scary. The transition is scary. You're going to be skeptical, but what I would suggest is just know that like, we're taking leaps of faith here, but it is the right thing to do. Your gut is right. Separate your ego, separate like your short-term KPIs, and just up level to like, even if you're an IC, to like owner. If I'm going to buy this business, if I'm going to invest in this company, like I would invest in HubSpot, Meta, name your whatever. Like, do I want to own this business? Is it a business that I want to own? And anyone can think about that. Your customer service rep, your anybody. Like, are we doing those things? We should start doing those things. But you gotta right size the fixed cost to be able to do that, man. I mean, I think it's like this biggest bummer of a thing. And it doesn't mean you have to fire. Just like, try to keep growing and don't hire for the next 2 years. You know what I mean? Yes. Like, hold off. You don't have to backfill. You don't have to do these sorts of things, and no one's getting fired. And yeah, anyways, those are a couple of things that I might sort of like think about. The conversation to have is just like, let's be real. Our awareness is zero. No one knows about us, even though like in our social circle, our bubble, I think everyone knows about. No one knows about us. No one knows what we do. No one feels anything towards us if we're just putting like product shot in a white background with like a buy now 15% off. You're not doing anything. So start doing the things that you know are right, and then find ways to measure it. Because I'm not saying just build a business on hope, because that's a good way to run a business, but just like get smarter in the way you're measuring and quantifying impact, because people have been doing it for centuries, right? Businesses and brands were built before Facebook, right? So just like learn what people have done, study, get smarter.
I love it. That's the perfect note to end on. Preston, thank you so much for coming on the pod today. We'll see everybody real soon.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So fun.
This data is wrong every freaking time.
Have you heard of HubSpot? HubSpot is a CRM platform where everything is fully integrated.
Whoa, I can see the client's whole history, calls, support tickets, emails, and here's a task from 3 days ago I totally missed.
HubSpot. Grow better.